Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness some scenes from the next attraction to play this theater. This picture, truly one of the most unusual ever filmed, contains scenes which under no circumstances should be viewed by anyone with a heart condition or anyone who is easily upset. We urgently recommend that if you are such a person or the parent of a young or impressionable child now in attendance, that you and the child leave the auditorium for the next 90 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to violence, the word and the act. While violence cloaks itself in a plethora of disguises, its favorite mantle still remains sex. Violence devours all it touches, its voracious appetite rarely fulfilled. Yet violence doesn't only destroy, it creates and molds as well. Let's examine closely then this dangerously evil creation, this new breed, encased and contained within the supple skin of woman. The softness is there, the unmistakable smell of female. The surface, shiny and silken. The body yielding yet wanton. But a word of caution, handle with care and don't drop your guard. This rapacious new breed prowls both alone and in packs, operating at any level, any time, anywhere, and with anybody. Who are they? One might be your secretary, your doctor's receptionist, or a dancer in a go-go club.
Well, now that we have your undivided attention, it's the show that's all about movies on public radio, KCBX. Take two. Across the aisle from me, the connoisseur and aficionado of all that is sensational, and who's sensational himself, it's Bob Whiteford.
And across the aisle from me, right now he's currently getting his Cuban cigar ready. The Sultan of SLEAZE here on the Central Coast, and I mean that just for tonight's show only, the incomparable Jim Dee.
Great to see you, Bob.
Same here, Jimmy. Good to see you, too.
And we have Hank, the greatest projectionist on the planet, and our great listeners out there. And before we dovetail off of that amazing opening that we put together for you on today's show, Bob and I do want to acknowledge the passing of a great writer, actor, and I consider Spalding Gray a great storyteller. They found his body today. Spalding Gray passed away. He was grappling with depression. And, he did some really great things as far as Swimming to Cambodia, Monster in a Box. Another film of his is just Spalding talking. He was in The Killing Fields, Beaches. He had a small role in the Steven Soderbergh film King of the Hill that I liked a lot. Goes way back. But we want to acknowledge the great writer, actor, Spalding Gray,
whose body was found today, almost 2 months after he disappeared. And I echo Jim's sentiments. A great talent. He'll be sorely missed.
And to mention what a great storyteller he was, rent Swimming to Cambodia, the power of just a person telling a story. Spalding had it down, and we'll miss him. He was a unique writer and actor.
Absolutely, Jimmy.
Well, as you may surmise from the opening, tonight's subject on Take Two is sensationalism and sleaze. And folks, we didn't really come up with this on our own. It was a few weeks back when we did our show on coming attractions. We were looking forward to, in 2004, 2005, lots of films coming up, and we were really excited about lots of, great directors and their new projects coming out. And in order to give you a little, break up some of our conversation, we played some of these very sleazy trailers from the 60s. And lo and behold, you great listeners out there didn't seem to care that much about what we were talking about current films. Everyone seemed to be interested in those trailers from the 50s and 60s.
I believe we were playing some of the great films of the auteur of bad, the grande dame of bad cinema herself, Doris Wishman. Such classics as Bad Girls Go to Hell, Another Day, Another Man. And Jim and I were just blown away by your response out there in Radio Land. So we decided Tonight, we're going to honor these films. We're going to talk about sex in cinema, pre-pornography, maybe going up to, if we can squeeze it in, pardon the pun, maybe go from the early days of film to Deep Throat, which was the film that changed everything in regards to sex. And Jimmy, maybe we should just get going with it.
Well, Bob, I remember you saying probably a couple of years ago that one of the first things, as soon as film was invented, they were shooting a dancing woman, which was considered extremely erotic and nasty, and it was just and the first film was a screen kiss, or one of the very first Thomas Edison films, I believe, was a screen kiss, which was considered shocking at the time.
Absolutely. I once saw a documentary called The Story of X-rated cinema, which was quite fascinating. The Lumieres, when they came out with their motion picture cameras, first thing they filmed was a train or something. Second thing they filmed was a woman with no clothes on.
And this is the late 1800s, isn't it?
Right. This was just as soon as you could make motion pictures, one of the first things you did was get somebody up there with no clothes on to titillate the audience, so to speak. And movies have continued doing that till today.
The word demographic is something relatively new, but back in those days, what we're actually getting to, or the core of this show, is there is that demographic that will get people out of their homes into the movie theater to see something that is slightly sleazy or slightly sensational, and it's played through till today from the beginning of cinema, as we said. It's the demographic of sensationalism.
And, the blue movie has certainly been with us. And the blue movie, folks, is kind of a term that was used for pornography, explicit sex on film. That's been there almost from the beginning. Well, from the beginning, from about, I think the earliest examples of those go back to about 1900, 1899. And, for many years, they were kind of hidden in the back rooms, in the, cigar-filled card rooms, stag movies. You definitely could get in a lot of trouble for making these films, and you could get in considerable trouble for many years just for playing them. Of course, they were produced, they starred real people, and, where they came from, nobody knew. Where they were shown, nobody, quote-unquote, knew, but a lot of people were watching them. And they definitely had an influence in the early days of talkie Hollywood.
Yes, in fact, we've got some really interesting clips, and we're going to have some help from good old Leonard Maltin, because some of these pre-code films, and we should go on about what pre-code means. In 1934, Hollywood imposed the Hays Code, or the Motion Picture Production Code, on itself, which was, as you'll hear Leonard Maltin mention, there was an outcry from churches and social groups, and the fact that movies with certain subject matter were not, there was an uproar, there was a controversy, and rather than Hollywood letting these groups impose rules on them, they created their own rules, even though they did adhere to them, and movies changed drastically right after 1934 from some of the ones we're going to be playing for you, some clips from films with great motion picture stars. James Cagney, we're going to be hearing some clips with John Wayne, for instance, and Barbara Stanwyck, who were starring in these maybe hour-long, 70-minute films that got into, for the time, sordid subjects. And we should just listen to Leonard Maltin right now when he's going to comment on James Cagney in the film Lady Killer, which was made in 1933, and he'll give you the gist of what we're talking about.
The idea of the production code of 1934 was to clean up Hollywood's morals on screen. which had become a source of notoriety and controversy. Well, the code did its job. It sanitized Hollywood's movies, but it had unexpected side effects. It changed the course of some stars' careers. A perfect example of that, James Cagney.
Cagney started his career on screen pursuing a life of crime and made movie history in the title role of Public Enemy. But in most of his early 30s films, he wasn't a gangster. He was a promoter, a hustler, a street-smart survivor who was as fast with his mouth as he was with his fists.
Smart little guy, ain't you?
I've been around.
Once the code came into effect, Hollywood had to abandon these unsavory but colorful characters, and Warner Brothers had a real challenge, finding morally upstanding roles for Cagney to play that wouldn't rob him of his dynamic personality. If the code had its way, Cagney probably would have been robbed of his most famous movie scene.
Just 2 years after Public Enemy, Cagney made Lady Killer, which makes fun of his one-time typecasting in criminal roles and offers a lot of laughs at Hollywood's expense, too. It's prime pre-code Cagney, especially in his treatment of women, which amounts to assault and battery. And the principal victim is Mae Clarke, the same actress who got the grapefruit in the face. Now, 2 years after this, when the code was in force, Cagney was playing Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream and an FBI agent in G-Men. No more kicking women in the derriere. But that's exactly what identifies Lady Killer as a piece of forbidden Hollywood.
That is Leonard Maltin introducing the film Lady Killer. And what's kind of nice in some of these MGM VHS copies of these films, Leonard Maltin, talking about actually what was happening in Hollywood and with the production code that did come into effect in 1934.
This is a fascinating series of films. I believe MGM UA released maybe a half dozen or so, and they explicitly deal with sexual issues, really hot-button political issues, social issues, drugs, all kinds of stuff that you weren't going to see a couple of years later. Or if it was going to be presented, it was going to be so watered down as to almost be unrecognizable. And that led to a subject we had talked about a long time ago, what Martin Scorsese called the smugglers, having to smuggle these ideas into films. But in the early 30s, the late 20s, around 1929 to 1933, they were showing this openly. And a lot of these films are as racy and as topical as films that would come out in the 60s and 70s.
Here's a taste of what Leonard Maltin was talking about with James Cagney in the 1933 film Lady Killer. In this clip, James Cagney he's become kind of a movie star, and a critic has written a scathing review of a friend of his. So what James Cagney does in this scene is pulls the critic aside and says, come into my office, which is the men's room, and here's the interchange.
You wrote this review yourself, didn't you?
Certainly. My name's on it.
Why do you guys always try to be sensational and make reputations for yourselves by filling your columns with a lot of cheap, nasty drivel at the expense of other people?
I'll write what I like.
Yeah, write what you like, but write it about motion pictures and lay off the private lives of the people in them.
I have a right to my opinion.
Sure you have a right to your opinion, and I'm going to let you keep it. You know what you're going to do? You're going to eat it.
Don't be silly.
Right where you are. Now, open your mouth and close your eyes.
You can't get away with this.
Open your mouth. Open! Now chew. Chew hard. Now swallow. Swallow! All right, let me see. All right. I wish I had another one. Here. Now, if you write any more cracks about Lois Underwood, I'll cut your ears off and mail them to your folks.
That's James Cagney from the film Lady Killer. And interestingly, Leonard Maltin said this is sort of a softened version, almost a parody of his role that he played in Public Enemy, which I think was also a contributor to bring in the Hays Code, or the Motion Picture Production Code, because it was, well, you check out Public Enemy, which was a couple years before. That's a tough film even by today's standards. Cagney is incredible in that film.
I mean, yeah, you think about the classic gangster films, Public Enemy, the one with Edward G. Robinson, which for some reason has escaped me, and I should be ashamed. Oh, Little Caesar.
Little Caesar. Is he Rico or Rocco in that?
I think he's Rico.
Okay.
You say Rico, I say Rocco. And the original Scarface with Paul Muni, beg your pardon, and Boris Karloff. These films are tough.
Yes.
And they're brutal, and
Yes.
they're violent, and they take no prisoners, and there's an air of raw sexuality there, especially with Cagney. He's just so dynamic. Everything he does is powerful. So you could imagine that the moral mastermind somewhere sitting there going, holy smokes, what have we unleashed here? And to think that these films would not have been made a few years later. And thank goodness we had them. I mean, you can also talk about the original Frankenstein, 1931. That had been cut severely in re-released versions. That one really pushed the envelope as well.
The original Frankenstein, I think we've played it on the program when we've had our monster shows, but there is an opening disclaimer that says, you know, this is scary stuff, and it really was. And of course, looking at Frankenstein today, the original Frankenstein, directed by James Whale, I mean, it's still incredibly, it's disturbing. It's great. It's great stuff.
Well, it is interesting that Warner Brothers was able to keep the gangster film alive. I'd say they changed it a little bit. Case in point, the Roaring Twenties. Cagney doesn't get the girl. The girl goes for the nice guy, not for the hoodlum with a heart of gold. He gets a bad girl. I think Joan Blondell plays her. But we're kind of getting off maybe on a tangent here. But the first films, Pre-Code, the Hays Code, fascinating. Check them out, folks.
And, you know, I was going to bring in the Hays Code because it's readily available if you go on your computer and you punch in the Motion Picture Production Code or the Hays Code. There it is. You can see it. And rather than us reading to you those specific details that you don't show this or you don't show that, the overriding universal theme of this code was not to undermine the moral standard of the movie viewer. That's sort of the that's sort of the crux of it. But they do go into very detailed, explicit sections of this thing where they say what you can show, what you can't show. But it's basically, we don't want to lower the moral standards of viewers.
We can read that as sexuality out. Raw sexuality is out or watered down to the point where it's unrecognizable. Violence, on the other hand, we can work with that.
Yes. That's always as we've been talking about, Bob, when we've been discussing the show, violence somehow is okay. I mean, when you get past the code and you get into the 40s and 50s with film noir and other things, violence seems to be okay, but sexuality is the major taboo, along with drugs. And but let's look into that sexuality part. Let's call once again upon Leonard Maltin. He's going to talk about apparently the film that really brought on the Hays Code. This is from 1933. Leonard Maltin discussing the film starring Barbara Stanwyck called Babyface.
It wasn't until the late 60s that Hollywood started trafficking in four-letter words on a regular basis. But in the early 30s, there was a definite emphasis on one three-letter word, sex. Remember, this was a time when a man and woman living together was shocking and pretty much verboten. Sex was a natural byproduct of love and marriage, but it was not a subject for polite conversation. But in the early 30s, before the production code came into effect, illicit sex was rampant in Hollywood. On the screen, I mean. A man and a woman spending the night together without benefit of marriage was shocking stuff, but it became commonplace in films of this period. There were often recriminations, not to mention babies.
But sex was accepted as a normal urge, and one that was hard to resist, even in the face of potential scandal.
There's only one thing I want.
Name it and it's yours.
I'd like to have a Mrs. on my tombstone.
A double standard definitely existed for men and women, and it isn't hard to guess who suffered the most. Women were the victims, the outcasts, the ones who sacrificed their reputations along with their virginity.
But not in this movie. Babyface is an altogether astonishing fable of a young woman whose horrible upbringing inspires her to make men her victims. And those men are depicted in this film as being slaves to sex, something you just didn't see very often at the neighborhood bijou. In point of fact, Babyface is often cited as one of the films that led to adoption of the production code in 1934. Church and civic groups were becoming increasingly vocal about the immorality of Hollywood films, and this picture certainly gave them plenty of ammunition. The movie industry decided to create its own code of moral standards rather than have it imposed on them from outsiders. That code put an end to films like this. Love and romance flourished, but sex virtually disappeared from Hollywood movies. Though it's an outlandish film, Babyface works because its star is so compelling. Barbara Stanwyck gives new meaning to the notion of sleeping your way to the top in this prime example of forbidden Hollywood.
Good to have Leonard Maltin on the Take Two staff on tonight's show. You know, he adds another little dimension to
Hank,
it.
make sure Leonard gets a refill on his coffee.
But so there you have it. You have this well-produced. I mean, these are Hollywood.
A-budget,
Yeah,
big studio films.
And truly, Babyface from 1933 with Barbara Stanwyck, who looks like she's barely out of her teens. She may even be in her late teens. She looks extremely young in this film. She is sleeping her way to the top. In fact, there's sections of this movie where, you know, she's down in the mail room, and then, of course, you know that she's, getting together with the guys. And the next scene is outside the building, and the camera pans up because now she's up in the mortgage section, you know. And to give you a taste of the sexual undercurrent of this 1933 film, here is a Barbara Stanwyck who goes to her boss, who all you have to do is look at the way they look at each other, and you know they've got something going. But of course, she's in the mortgage department. And then Barbara Stanwyck is approached by a very young John Wayne, who was, 10th billing in the credits, who looks like he's barely out of his teens. And of course, he'd like to go out with Babyface, who was Barbara Stanwyck. Here's a scene from Babyface from 1933.
This is the Benson mortgage. Will you look it over now?
Is the insurance clause here?
Yes, everything's incorporated in it.
Yes, this is a very serious case. I'm afraid we'll have to foreclose.
Look at that, will you? Sickening the way those two carry on. Oh, hello, Jimmy.
Listen, Babyface, how about having dinner tonight? I got 2 tickets for Vanities.
Oh, I'd love to, but I can't tonight.
Oh, I never see you anymore.
I never see anybody anymore. I'm working so hard.
Gee, but
I'm sorry. I have to go to bed early every night. Excuse me, will you?
You don't know you're out till they stop counting. Wake up, kid. Babyface is moving out of your class.
Yeah, that's the coworkers telling John Wayne he doesn't have a chance with her because he's a lowly, maybe he's in the mailroom or something. But now she's, having a good time with the CEOs of this company of 1933 in Babyface.
What a great film. This one just blew my mind when I saw it a couple of years back. Very entertaining, very frank in its sexuality. It's eye-opening, and in many ways very entertaining because it has all the trappings of the films that would come later, but it's got more of a punch to it. And you think, well, I guess people did think about these things back then. Mm-hmm. Because after the code, even married people slept in separate beds. Mm-hmm. And how odd was that?
And we're talking about Cagney. Of course, I love him as George M. Cohan in Yankee Doodle Dandy and his subsequent roles. But boy, he's when he's the real tough guy, and we're talking about real tough guy who makes the critics eat their newspaper reviews. Boy, there's something to that too. He's fabulous.
Absolutely.
Well, let's hit on another subject that we're still in the 30s, and of course we remember those films like Reefer Madness and Marijuana, Weed with Roots in Hell, and we've got a film here called Narcotic, which is the same year as some of the other films we've been talking about from 1933. And I think perhaps the redeeming value of some of these films like Reefer Madness is it does show the people who use drugs going crazy, and of course there's always someone warning that, you know, drugs are a nowhere road. And so I think they tried to put those things into these films to say, you know, we're teaching you a lesson, but still, for instance, in the film we have a clip from here, Narcotic, you know, they go for broke. It's the great doctor who's taking care of his patients, but he's curious about opium and starts to smoke it, and of course it's downhill from there very rapidly.
Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting, Jim. This Narcotic, which was produced by one of the great granddaddies of sleaze in American cinema, Dwayne Esper. He was a roadshow huckster who, finding ways to exploit a situation. Okay, you can show drugs and sex. He used to go around with childbirth films in the trunk of his car. He was one of this group called the 40 Thieves, who they would just come up with all this exploitative material, gussy it up with pseudo-scientific or legal add-ons to make it, quote-unquote, educational, but really they were swinging for the exploitation dollar and getting it. Dwayne Esper, probably one of the unheralded giants of American cinema. He predated such like Dave Friedman, the Sultan of Sleaze, who hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about, if not this week, sometime in the future. American International Pictures, Sam Arkoff. He was that kind of guy. George Weiss, you might remember him mentioned in the Tim Burton film Ed Wood, the guy who gave Ed Wood the chance to make Glen or Glenda. He goes, what do you think I do here? I make crap like Chain Girls, one of his classics, a film about lesbianism, which is it's so bad, it's funny. But, well, maybe I'm getting a little off the track here.
No, you're right on the track, Bob.
Here we are, Narcotic, the first Dwayne Esper film I think that I'm aware of. And this came out 1933, just as the code was being imposed, and he's already come up with the formula to keep the sleaze going. And here's the clip of the special government drug agent.
Before discussing his particular case, though, I'd better tell you a few facts about drug addiction. Then you can draw your own conclusions. You see, the drug always finds the weakest spot in character for its attack. The daring or wayward type start using it to satisfy their craving for adventure, while the moral coward takes a drug to get the courage which he otherwise does not possess. In either case, it soon subordinates the will. The man whose personal life is not involved with strain or excitement naturally has more of a chance for a cure. There are 1 million addicts in the United States, and the cure is a terrific problem for each and every one of these tragic men and women.
Realizing the opium problem in my country, I can appreciate yours. In China, we uprooted the opium poppy, prohibited importation, made a $36 million bonfire out of all the opium stores. Even though the other countries re-drugged our nation for their own gain, we know that the greatest friend to drugs is ignorance. Its enemy, education.
That's a clip from Narcotic from 1933, and I think that was a clip that sort of grounds the picture. It says, like, okay, we're putting the warnings out here. This is what happens to those who take drugs. In other words, it's like we're not just going completely for what we're really going for here. We're putting these things in the film to make it seem like, this is a warning, folks, even though you're going to see some sordid stuff in this film, which kind of give it some validity, I would think.
Here's an excerpt from Dave Friedman's great book called A Youth in Babylon, his autobiography, where he talks about his life in the sleazeploitation business. He is, without question, one of the, if they were to have a Mount Rushmore of sleazophiles, he'd be right there, cigar included. And there's an excellent documentary out about him and his partner in the film business, Dan Sani, called Mau Mau Sex Sex. It was written by Eddie Muller, who, I might add, is a major authority on the Grindhouse film, and he is the authority on film noir. But dig what Dave Friedman has to say about Dwayne Esper. According to Esper, his involvement in film began in the mid-20s, when he started producing and distributing cheapo pictures, boasting to me that he could make a 60-minute black and white silent western in 2 days on a budget of $1,200. It was, however, after the advent of sound that he made the movies for which he will be long remembered, classics of the pre-war exploitation film era. These included Modern Motherhood, an early Birth of a Baby film, a trio of drug dramas, Narcotic, Marijuana, and Reefer Madness. And come on, we've all seen Reefer Madness. Seventh Commandment, an Anti-Adultery Act, and Maniac, a study of severe mental disorders simplified for Scratch House audiences. And I think Scratch House, we can read that as second run, Chitlin Circuit, rural cinemas, where these guys would go town to town like Pied Pipers with these terrible really cheesy exploitative films. Sometimes they'd have a childbirth sequence tacked in. Sometimes they'd have natives from Africa or the Amazon dancing topless spliced in, and it titillated the masses. It got them all wound up, but they had their message. And we're able to pass them off as educational. And Esper, the genius, he found a little hole in the production code.
You're listening to the movie program on Public Radio, KCBX, San Luis Obispo, KSBX, Santa Barbara. Time for Bob and I to go over to the concession stand. We're going to refill our popcorns and more on this tantalizing subject.
Tonight's Take Two is sponsored by the Look Young Center, offering the latest techniques in aesthetic medicine, including Botox and collagen, administered by board-certified physicians in San Luis Obispo at 597-8349. Funds are also provided by Moore & Brothers Automotive, starring Frida, the dog of many alter egos, who is always glad to sniff your tires. Moore & Brothers Automotive on Broad near Tank Farm Road.
My two brothers building puns, sitting in the front row. They bought the candy. We don't need nothing more. I love a movie show, I tell you, in black and white. I don't care what it is. I don't care how small the theater is. I don't care who's playing.
We're back on Take Two, the movie program. We are very glad that you're there. Bob Whiteford is across the aisle from me, and my name is Jim Dee, and we're talking about sensationalism and sleaze. And folks, we do want to respect our audiences. We know there's a huge demographic of people that want to go see art. They want to go see movies that make a wonderful impact on them, whether it be a classic like Casablanca or, films for the ages like Citizen Kane. But tonight we're acknowledging that time-tested, always there demographic. Those that like things that are sensational and somewhat sleazy. It's there. It's there.
It's there. It's been with us, and tonight we're honoring these films with our sexploitation, sleazeploitation special.
And one other aspect. We're talking about films. I was just thinking of Max Fleischer and the Fleischer brothers who created Betty Boop, Popeye, and those great cartoons. And here again, you go prior to that production code of 1934. You can see the early Betty Boop cartoons from the early 30s where they're pretty racy. Her top comes off. Of course, she has a very short skirt and she has a garter on. She's pretty saucy even for a cartoon. And then we talk about the post-code Betty Boop, where she is extremely domesticated. She's got a dog at home. She usually goes to the professor who lives nearby and takes care of her problems. But, you look at the early Betty Boop, pre-code Betty Boop, you look at the post-code Betty Boop, we're talking about two different women.
Absolutely, Jim. That's brilliant, because if you ever want to see the yardstick of change, Betty Boop is a perfect example. Like you so eloquently put, before, we've got a pretty racy dish. Afterwards, we've got a kind of a Doris Day almost.
Yeah, that puts it really well. And I love the Fleischers, and I love the later cartoons as well. But still, there was a whole different mindset going on where things are coming alive, and it's Coco and Bimbo are there with Betty, although they're always giving her the eye. We're talking pre-34, but afterwards, a whole different story.
Getting back to exploitation, sensationalist cinema, there was a film that came out in 1940, I think 41, called Child Bride, and it was about a 13-year-old girl marrying some 50-some-odd-year-old guy, and that was quite stunning. The thing I find surprising about, one, it's not a very good movie. But the fact is that it was made and it was able to be shown. Mm-hmm. And it got a pretty wide distribution. In fact, you can find it on video from the good people up in Seattle at Something Weird Video. They specialize in all this stuff. They have thousands of titles. And this film I thought was kind of interesting in the fact that, one, it got made, two, it made a lot of money. And another great exploitation film from the 40s, it's a film called She Shoulda Said No, a.k.a. Wild Weed, and it came out in 1948, and it starred Lila Leeds. And you might remember Lila Leeds. She was the very attractive blonde that got busted with Bob Mitchum in his pot bust. You might remember the photo of the two of them standing up after they've been convicted. Mitchum's got a little smirk on his face, and she's got this kind of deer in the headlights look. Well, she was the star of her own film when she got out of jail called Wild Weed, and it was produced by Kroger Babb, definitely one of the sleaze classic filmmaker, exploitation geniuses. And that one I would recommend too, because it also has Jack Elam. It was actually a pretty decent movie.
Wow, Jack Elam, early days. We are going to go to the phones. We already have callers calling in. The number here is 549-8855 or 1-800-549-8855. A key of what you just said, Bob, is the fact that, these aren't little oddities or something. These movies were making boku bucks. That demographic that we're talking about, who like to go to these films, they went in droves. I mean, even the childbirth films and things like that were, like you said, in the back seat of some guy's car, and he brings it to a theater, purchases, buys out all the shows at the theater and shows it. These people were making lots of money.
They sure were. And these films cost virtually nothing to make.
Yes.
I mean, even something like She Shoulda Said No, which definitely had production values, that were above some, like, say, the aforementioned Child Bride, made for $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, and they're bringing in $250,000, $300,000, and we're talking $1948. So the return on investment was staggering.
Give us a call on Take Two. It's 549-8855, 1-800-549-8855. Give us your name and where you're calling from. And good evening. You're on Take Two.
Yeah, Bob and Jim.
Yes.
This is Tom.
Hi, Tom.
How you doing?
Good.
Hey, guys, before you get into the sex and sleaze thing, I mean, I'm into that. But, I wanted to acknowledge your, giving Spalding Gray his, what a great man. He was just incredible with his documentaries and doing his whole thing with the Pol Pot thing in Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, and really covering all that real well, and carrying it on and on and on with the Vietnam, the whole sequence with Vietnam and whatnot. I'm just kind of wondering, where we're going to go from what he was doing and what Michael Moore is doing right now, and the parallels to those two things. I think you might want to think maybe doing something in the future on that. What's going on right now in Afghanistan, which a lot of people don't realize what's happening there right now with the whole, you were talking about the drug thing earlier, and the global heroin epidemic that's going on, and he was right on top of that, and Michael Moore is kind of hitting the whole political side of that thing with all of the corporate people that are involved and a lot of that stuff that's going on. And anyway, you guys are doing a great job.
Thanks, Tommy.
Yeah.
Something? On that subject and bridging to our tonight's subject, Roger Corman came out with a film 2 months after the September 11th attacks called Escape from Afghanistan. And what he did
I've never seen that. I'd love to see that.
Oh, Tom, it's a piece of junk. And what's great about it, and I mean that in a facetious way, is he took an old Russian film about when they were in Afghanistan, purchased it, re-edited it, and and added American actors to make it contemporary with what we were doing at that time.
The political hype.
Yeah. And but that's classic Corman. I mean, it was kind of heartwarming to see him cashing in very quickly. It almost made things seem like, a sense of normalcy.
Wow.
But I think that's a point well taken, and
right.
I'm sure we will discuss these films in the future.
Great. Gentlemen, carry on. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Good evening. You're on Take Two.
Is that me?
That's you.
Hey, can't believe, that's one of the problems on that is sometimes when you're listening, it's hard to tell whether it's on the phone, whether it's you or not. Anyway, Charlie from Lompoc.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Charlie.
Yeah, a couple of things is the term pot boiler, I think, comes from some of these films. Because generally when they would, the couple would be, or they would be heading to bed, and it would fade to the pot on the stove, usually milk, as that was boiling over. That was a way of insinuating by not showing the sexual scenes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you've heard that, the term pot boiler. Another comment, particularly during the height of the Code, you mentioned violence. Now, I've understood that many of the European distributors and audience were far more upset with the amount of violence in American films.
Still,
and they thought we were being rather prudish about the sex element.
Oh, I agree with you there. But even though I think Europe loved our gangster films, I mean, they.
But I think as say they particularly so. I think it was say the violence was.
Well,
more.
in the 70s, Charlie, the Europeans definitely tapped into this type of film when they started doing fascist erotica, and some of this stuff. One of the masters in Europe of this type of sex, violence, sleaze, a fellow named Jess Franco. He's a Spanish filmmaker. He did some films that were pretty hairy sexually, and the violence, too, is pretty intense as well. Every now and then, in fact, the French came out with a movie a few years ago called Baissez-moi, and I can't translate it into English because it's obscene.
Okay.
But what they did
Kiss
was...
my whatever.
No, it's...
Baissez.
But what it was an experiment in violence and sex. They showed gratuitous violence, which doesn't raise an eyebrow anywhere anymore. But what they did was they added sex that was just as graphic as a hardcore pornographic film in juxtaposition with the violence, and it's a pretty startling film. And I wouldn't say it's a great movie, but what it is, it's a message. It's saying, okay, you're saying this amount of violence is okay, and the violence is heavy duty, and now we're going to give you sex on the same level. How do you like it?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, I think the amount of violence in films on both sides of the Atlantic and other is escalating.
Well, what happens here is that early on in the production code, filmmakers were able to have nudity in films, and we're not talking mainstream Hollywood films here, but they could have nudity as long and if it was masked in an act of violence, rape, or some kind of brutal murder, you could show a breast. But if you showed a woman's breast in terms of lovemaking, or, what people would think if they saw a beautiful woman, maybe you'd feel amorous or something, that was taboo. But you could have her eyes gouged out, you could have her beaten till where flesh is falling off of her, then you can squeeze in the nudity. These guys were not moral masters. What they were, they knew that sex sold, and they had to find a way to get the sex in the film. And they always found that they could do it easier with violence.
Yeah, good old American, keep the double standard flying.
Well,
absolutely.
But I also feel it's a worldwide phenomenon.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It is now, definitely.
Well, look at the flap over the, I didn't see, but you've certainly heard about it, the Super Bowl incident. I understand a lot of the stuff leading in that implied a lot of violence, rough handling, rough thing, and then people focused on, 3 to 5 seconds of bare breast.
Mm-hmm. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, but as I say, I understand a lot. I understand, again, not seeing that. Weren't there advertisements for Viagra and?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, come on now. That's kids are going to be put off by 5 minutes of 5 seconds of breast, and the parents having to explain about what Viagra does. Come on now.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, hey, enjoy your show. Listen to it every chance I get. I missed your one on. Every once in a while, my schedule makes me miss one, but I'm really encouraging and talking up your show is a good one.
Charlie, thank you so much.
Right.
Take care. Well, 549-8855, 1-800-549-8855. We're talking about that interesting demographic of film and cinema that seems to push the limit, that seems to be, there's an audience out there always for something a little extreme. Hey, we'll bring. I'm not going to talk about religion or spirituality, but the current film that's the number one film brought in $200 million. We were talking about this, Bob. I'm really curious if Mel Gibson's film, if it were G-rated and just talked about Jesus, for instance, in a way that if his teachings maybe ended with the Last Supper, if it was beautifully photographed, music by Elmer Bernstein, as I mentioned, rated G, I wonder if it would make $200 million. It's interesting.
You got to wonder. I tend to think in selling his film, I think he took a page out of Dwayne Esper's book.
Okay. Good evening. You're on Take Two.
Oh, good evening. This is Gary from SLO.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, how you guys doing? Gee, whose idea was this show tonight, I wonder?
Our listeners.
Oh, yeah, that's... Okay, Bob, I'll believe you on that one.
Okay.
There was a couple of movies during the 50s that were maybe even the early 60s, Mondo Connie and Mondo Amor or Mondo something.
Absolutely.
Oh, a lot more than that, too, and they were a major genre.
And they were supposedly reality, and so they got away with showing a whole lot of stuff that you didn't think you were ever going to see. And we only saw them at the drive-in movie when I was young. That was the only place that would show them. We still had a drive-in. They would too long ago, and a lot of people had them.
Oh, the Mondo film was huge. It was a phenomenon, and again, it had that kind of pseudo-documentary, kind of taking a page from Esper's book. You mask it as something, either art, in this case, kind of art, like true life documentary art, and you can titillate and exploit and have a great time with it. Because part of the fun of the Mondo film is looking at the segments, wondering which ones they really went out and filmed that really existed, and the other ones that they kind of made up to fill it up.
Well, as always, another interesting show. Thanks a lot, guys.
Oh, thanks for the call. Good evening. You're on Take Two.
Hi, I'm Don from San Ynez.
Hi, Don.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Didn't Hedy Lamarr do a nude scene? Wasn't that one of the famous things?
That was in a film called Ecstasy that came out in 1933. It was made in Europe. I believe it was done in Germany or her native Czechoslovakia. And what happened was the film had a little bit of nudity in it. But I think what was objected to when the film was brought over here to be shown is she was being kissed and caressed by a man, and her face showed her enjoying it a little too much. There was a major uproar over having that film released in its entirety that kind of mirrored the controversy around the Danish film I'm Curious Yellow from the mid-'60s. Ultimately, the film was released in the U.S. after the Hays Code, and the offending scenes, there was her swimming in a lake nude was cut. But what was really cut out was the scene where she was being kissed and caressed by this man, and there was a close-up of her face digging it a little too much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, because I couldn't remember what movie it was, but I'll have to remember to rent it.
Oh, absolutely. It's available in its original form, the original cut of it, and you'd be startled. It's so tame. It's really silly that they made such a big deal over it.
Well, great show. Keep it up. Thanks.
Thanks for your call, Don.
Okay.
Good evening. You're on Take Two. Oop. Hi there. You're on Take Two.
Yes, I was wondering. I picked up Caligula the other, and I was rather shocked at the explicit sex that was in that film.
Bob Guccione.
Oh, my goodness. Directed by the great Tinto Brass. And again, there's further proof that films coming out of Europe could really push the envelope with both sex and violence. That film it was an epic production. It features Peter O'Toole, Sir John Gielgud,
Malcolm McDowell
as the aforementioned Caligula. In America, I know that it is available in several different versions. If you don't like, if you want Caligula light, there is actually an R-rated version of it where they kind of, they'll remove quite a few of the perversions. Because let's face it, that film, every perversion known to humankind is in this movie. And it's pretty hairy. What did you think to it?
Well, it wasn't rated, and it wasn't in the back room, and it was somewhat of a shock, but I didn't shut it off.
Interesting. So you saw it all the way through?
Yes, I did.
Because it's a fairly long movie.
And, as you say, the production was great, the stars were great, the acting was good, the cinematography was good. It was just, a little over the top.
Yeah.
Way over the top.
Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that one. It's I had never gotten big stars in such an X-rated movie.
Well, interestingly, we've only gotten up to maybe, the 40s and 50s, and this show we could have gotten into the 60s, 70s, and there's a whole lot more. In fact, Caligula was made in the 70s, maybe, or 80s?
Early 80s.
Early
I think
80s.
around 82. And there was quite a storm of controversy around that film as well when it came out. But in that case, it equated into big box office.
Yes.
And did they get away with it in this sense that it was historic and so forth?
Absolutely. They used that historical context. They had big stars and a big budget. So, yeah, they masked their exploitation effort quite well. That film cost probably about $50 million to make over 24 years ago. Quite an exercise in exploitation. I'm sure the masters would have been proud.
Well, and the violence was as shocking as anything else.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Boy.
Well, anyway, I just thought I'd better mention that one.
Well, appreciate you sharing.
Glad
the fact
you
that
did.
You watched
Okay.
Caligula.
Yeah.
Thanks for calling.
Surely. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Jimmy, I've only seen it once, and there was just no way I could ever go back and see it again. I'm glad I saw it once.
Yeah, I as much of a Malcolm McDowell, Peter O'Toole fan, John Gielgud, I just never brought myself to see it.
It's just not something I would think of.
I thought Bob Guccione, who was publisher of Penthouse, was the director, but was he the producer?
He was the producer.
Okay.
Tinto Brass, who did a lot of European sexploitation films. He cut his teeth on this one.
Boy.
Oh, boy.
Well, I want to thank you, Bob, for being here, Hank, the greatest projectionist, and the greatest listeners. And, truth be told, we only got pretty much halfway through this because starting in the early days of cinema and that sensational demographic, which began at the beginning of cinema, carried through, and by golly, it's carrying through right through till now. It may look a little different, the production values may be higher, but that element is still alive and well. And
we may have to revisit this somewhere down the road.
Yeah, the more current versions of sleaze and sensationalism. Want to thank all the listeners, and we'll be back again next week on Public Radio KCBX with the movie program Take Two.
Take care, everybody. We'll catch you next Monday.
Morena, oh,